Welcome to the Witness and Persecution podcast with Nik and Ruth Ripken, where we equip you with biblical principles and truths and practices learned from believers in persecution to help you cross the street and cross the oceans with the good news of Jesus Christ. I'm your host, Anthony Ball. If you're enjoying our podcast or if you've been blessed by it, desire to share it with others, we'd encourage you. We'd love for you to go to the platform that you choose on this podcast and like and subscribe. And leave a review for Witness and Persecution with Nik and Ruth Ripken. We have talked about this several times, but the audience keeps growing, Nik, globally, over and over every week. There's more people in more countries, and we are so blessed by that. And so you as our listeners, you're the reason why this is growing, and you're the reason why these truths and practices, getting to be mentored by, learning from believers in persecution, that's the reason why more people around the globe are hearing about this. Nik, where I am, it's 108 today. It feels like 114. So I hope you're a little bit cooler.
Yeah, but you just made my point. Um, when we look at the reasons why the unreached are unreached, you might not, our listeners might not ever imagine that climate plays a big role in why the unreached are unreached. It plays a huge role because one of my colleagues did this, Anthony. We were talking about why the unreached were unreached among ourselves because they were all of their team was working in the northern part of Africa, in the Islamic parts, the desert regions, and where it's tremendously hot, and they were just talking about what it's like to work in triple digit weather, and we're talking 120 to 150 degrees.
Mm.
And I go and visit one of our surgeons, and he's got a little room in the hospital. And I had it was the first time I got to visit him there. He's just been there a few months, and he's retired military, so he's tough. But he's got this one little operating room, and I go in there, and it is not 10 feet by 8 feet, and it's got a door in the side wall and a door in the hallway, but there's no door there. So he's doing a surgery, and people are walking in and out. And on the floor is a
Unbelievable.
lady in the latter stages of giving birth. On the table, he's repairing this older man's
Mm.
abdomen so that he can marry a girl that's under 15 years of age. And he's sweating because
Wow.
there's an air conditioner in the wall of that little room, and it's completely frozen and rusted, and it probably hasn't worked for 15 years, and people are
Mm.
walking in and out, and cats are coming in there, standing underneath the table that he's doing surgery, and he's never under
Wow.
triple digits, and he doesn't even have a fan. And I asked him,
Mm.
I said, "Why have you not got an air conditioner here? Because I know that one hasn't worked for 30 years." He said, "Well, there's no budget money in the budget for that." And I said, "I will find it." And I canceled my flight out, went and bought an air conditioner, and we had it installed in 3 days. Not only that, we had two doors put on his surgical room and where he could lock them, and so he wouldn't have cats and
Wow.
people coming in and out, and it just changed his ability to stay in that kind of heat and do surgery in an environment which wasn't just where he's sweating into his patient. What a
Incredible.
friend of mine did is this, Anthony. He took the continent of Africa, and what he did was he put a piece of cellophane. He superimposed. Now, uh, um, how did he do this? He took and he laid something over the map of Africa, and it showed the temperatures of Africa, of all the different places. And
Mm.
then what he did to over that, he laid over that where the workers are, missionaries in the open countries, what we call other things, tent makers in the closed countries, and
Mm.
where the temperature went up in the triple digits. And in our one country, it was 120 to 150 in the summertime, like what you're experiencing in Texas right now, but
Right.
no fans, no air conditioning. Try to work during the day, try to sleep at night. Both of those almost
Yeah.
become impossible. And so when he put that environmental map over Africa, he could show us it, realistically, as the temperature went up, the number of Western workers went down. And as the
Mm.
temperature went up, the presence of Islam increased. And what,
Interesting.
yes, you wouldn't ever
Huh.
think of that. And when you look at unreached peoples, they're in the mountains and they're snowbound, they're icebound. They're in places where there's no heating. It's whatever uh, dried cow dung that you can gather, what small stove you might have, but there's no real heating. And like where I grew up in an unfinished attic, where myself and five of my brothers stayed. My last born child, the seventh child, got the only bedroom other than our moms and dads down in the main house. And if we took a glass of water to bed in the wintertime, it froze. And at night, we
Wow.
had in that attic, we had a fan at each end of it, and we plugged that in. But I never slept in a bed by myself until I went to college. And I'm telling you, sticking to the sheets and sticking to your brother is not a way to
Hmm.
get a good night's sleep. And especially when you're working construction and working on the farm in the daytime, even when we're going to school, working those weekends. So, in a way, I was
Mm.
conditioned for the hotter places and the poorer places. But the fact of the matter is, we don't understand how much climate plays in where Western workers go and where the
Mm.
temperature soars and where the temperature in the mountains goes way down, so does the number of workers. Why are the
Wow.
unreached are unreached is because a large portion of those who are not reached with the gospel of Jesus Christ are in the places that are in the triple digits most of the year, are they're in the minus territory, and that
Mm.
affects you know why also, because the malaria mosquitoes cannot live above, I think it's 5,700 feet. So if
Right.
you look at
Yeah.
where the mission compounds are, where the workers are, where the schools and the hospitals are, so that we can get our medical care and we can have our kids educated, those schools and hospitals are above 5,700 feet. They're above the mosquito belt.
I never thought about that before.
And so, uh, and the reason why we don't think about it is because if we don't go to the unreached globally, then why would it come to your consciousness? But you could
Mm.
imagine what it's like to the pioneers that came to Texas, that came to Oklahoma, that came out for for financial, for farms and ranches, and because they were promised so much land and part of Central Southwest America. I don't remember exact locations, but you can imagine what they suffered through and how hard they
Mm.
were,
Yeah.
and just how difficult worship was, and how hot it was. But climate, there's a direct relationship. As the heat goes up or as it bottoms out, the numbers of workers among unreached peoples that inhabit those places stays very, very low. Climate
Mm.
has a bigger role to play of why the unreached are unreached than most of us could even articulate. And apparently, it surprised you a little bit.
Yeah, I can imagine it now, but that's a huge surprise to me.
Well, I can tell you when there's no AC and no way to avoid the heat, and you stop between the living room and the kitchen, and you want to hug your wife, and there's just this sticky slurpy sound because you're so sweaty. It's just exhausting. Anthony, in southern Africa, I used to go out. I don't think it helped except psychologically. In the summertime, it was so hot. I would take a hose because we had a borehole, and I would
Hmm.
take a hose and wet the brick, the concrete brick, around our bedrooms before we go to bed at night, hoping somehow that the evaporation of those brick would make it at least tolerable, and we would take the sheets and take them into the shower and get them damp and put them over our three boys and put them over us, and we would sleep a little bit for a few hours until those sheets dried out, and then it became very very uncomfortable again. And we
Mm,
had a generator that we ran about 4 hours a day to charge our refrigerator, to charge our -30 freezer, and to pump our water, and everything else we did off of bottled gas that we brought in from South Africa, and
mm.
so in the wintertime we had a little gas space heater, which is not very healthy to breathe that stuff, and we
Yeah,
just
that's
pushed
right.
it in room to room to room, where us and the boys were, and to heat that in the daytime. And at nighttime, we just put on, in daytime, we just put on more layers of clothes and more blankets. And in the summertime,
Mm.
we wet our bedclothes and so that we could sleep more. I'm just promising you that if you have the option of a more of a more generous climate, if you would, and access to electricity, and electricity you can afford to have an AC.
Yeah.
We lived in the Middle East, and we could not afford that AC at all.
Well, it's just pretty common around some of these places that even if you have the capability to have AC, you can't afford to run it. So it doesn't really matter if you've got one or not. It's still going to be hot.
And so what you do then, you tend in these places, like even in southern Africa, to go to the urban centers where you have
Mm.
piped in water, and you have electricity, and you don't have to spend so much money on travel, and even you know I'm going to mention this in a minute, but just let's leave it at this, that when the temperature goes high and the temperature
Hmm.
goes low, the number of Western workers decreases. And yet, it's in those
Wow.
very environments that you'll find your Hindus and your Buddhists and your Muslims, particularly.
Mm.
That's where they are, but that's where you're going to find the unreached.
Right.
And so we're looking together at about 8 different reasons of why the unreached are unreached. But the one that surprises people the most is climate. Climate affects
Yeah.
how little we tend to go to places that are frozen a good part of the year or boiling hot a good part of the year.
Mm. Wow. Yeah, that does
And
surprise me. I would have never thought that'd be a major reason.
well, just map Texas, and look at the population of Texas where you live. I hope it's all
Hmm.
right to say that, and
Sure.
just map how many people are in the rural areas and how many are in the urban centers.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
80-90% of your people are going to be in those urban centers. Now, when you
Yeah.
looked at those and you look at those, and now water has access to water has a whole lot to do with that.
Hmm.
But if you were looking at the earlier inhabitants, American, the early what they call First Nations in Canada, where we were last week, and you look at Hispanics, they lived in really hot and hard places, but so our people generally grow up in places that have access to clean water, to electricity, where they
Mm.
can heat their homes and they can cool their homes. And we don't generally go to places where either the temperature is extreme one way or the other. And that contributes to the reasons why the unreached are unreached. We just don't go to the harsh places environmentally.
Right. That makes so much sense.
And
Wow.
Muslims will often say Christianity is for girly guys and Islam is for tough men. And they're saying that because they're herding their camels and they're herding their goats and they're sleeping on the ground and they're living in tents and they're living. Somalis will build this wattle stick house that they can put together very quickly, and they carry it on the back of their camel as they go from water well to water well.
Mm.
And they look at the workers and they look at themselves and say, Westerners, Christianity was made for soft men, and Islam was made for the tough men of the desert. I've heard
Hmm.
that over and over and over again from Muslims, and uh, they see us as people that wear suits when they are people that wear long layers, thobes, and long layers of gowns that keep the sweat close to their bodies, so that when it evaporates, it gives some cooling. But we can move
Mm.
on. But number six is not a small thing. When you're
Yeah.
looking at climate and you're looking at building a team in places that often are snowed in, frozen over, and where it's just horrible heat, and where the malaria and the other diseases abound in that kind of heat, uh,
Mm.
we tend to gravitate away from those places.
Yeah. Wow.
Peoples that are unreached, many of them are in the mountains and they're in the deserts. They're at
Mm.
the extremes of elevation. And our missionary compounds, our hospitals, our schools are generally above 5,700 feet. So they're not too high and they're not too low. That's where the schools are. That's where the hospitals are. That's where the cities are.
Mm.
For a big part, except for your coastal cities that are along the ocean. And number
Mm.
seven shouldn't surprise anybody, but it is expensive to go to the unreached.
Right.
Now, Anthony, I'm gonna when we went to Somalia, uh, and no one else was there. There's just a handful of us working there from the West. We had to, unlike other workers out of Kenya, Tanzania, we had to rent our cars. We don't own our cars. Everybody in Kenya, through their mission, they had a mission owned vehicle, maybe more than
Mm.
one, and they had access to mechanics. We go to Somalia. There's no way for us to even rent, I mean, to own a vehicle, no way to
Right.
get a mechanic or a mechanic. And so when we first went in there, I'm renting a compound for $400 a month, and I can rent a two wheel drive sedan for $30 a month and a 4x4 for $40 a month. And then after we're there a
Wow.
year and a half, not quite 2 years, Restore Hope, United Nations comes in. The U.S. military coalition leads 32,000 troops from around the world. into Somalia, and all of a sudden, overnight, this is what the United Nations does wherever it goes.
Mm.
The cost for us to rent a vehicle went from $40 a month to $400 a month.
Wow.
And our house rent for a
Wow.
3-floor villa with a 8-foot wall around it with cut glass embedded in the tops of the villa.
Hmm.
Uh, 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 that rent we paid $400 to $500 a month, and we kept our medical and food supplies on the ground floor. We ran the office, we ran the kitchen and the bathroom and the offices usually on the second floor and on the third floor because we could get more breeze. And I probably 90% of the time in those 7 years when I was in Somalia, I slept on the roof because at
I
night
would.
I could get a breeze from the Indian Ocean. Because when the generators go off, nobody runs the generators all night. And when the generators go off, you don't even have a fan. And so you've got to sleep with the windows open, mosquitoes. You have to sleep under a mosquito net, and it's just wears you out. You're working 80-hour weeks, and then you can't sleep because of the heat. But what I'm saying here, the rent of that compound went from $400 a month to 10,000.
Oh, you gotta be kidding.
Now,
Wow.
Now, we were raising money through the United Nations, Red Cross, and donors from all over the world. And our own mission board gave us over $1 million to do humanitarian work there. But whose budget? You're going from a country that you own your vehicles, you own your house, you have your own mechanics, you have
Mm.
people to take care of your property and to fix the heaters and to repair the water heaters and all that kind of thing. And you go into Somalia, you don't have any of that, and all of a sudden
Mm.
your
Right.
budget goes from $400 for vehicles, $40 for vehicles, and $400 for a compound, and it goes to $400, and I have to have 4 vehicles. Goes to $400, comes with 4 guards that you have to support, and your house is anywhere from $6 to $10,000.
Mm.
And unless you have special
Wow.
gifts from relationships with the church, the budget you have to go among unreached people groups is the same budget you have for open countries.
Right.
We all have the same salary, which is fine. We all have the same medical support, which is fine, except in Somalia, you don't have any access to any medical care.
Yeah, it doesn't
Ex-
matter that much there.
except through the nurses that you have. And then later on, when the U.S. military got set up, they set up a MASH unit, and I broke my collarbone inside of Somalia, fell going up stairs up to the roof during a rainstorm, and I went to that MASH unit. That 4 Somalis went with me, and they stood in that airlock going into that tent of a MASH unit, and they looked outside into Somalia, into Mogadishu, and they looked inside to the most modern hospital that you could imagine on earth. And the Somalis said to me, we can't be on the same planet, let alone in the same
Mm.
city. And I go in there and I see an orthopedic surgeon, and so, but you can't count on that. In 90% of the places we're going to be, you can't count on having a MASH unit there, or you hope
Mm.
there's not a MASH
Right.
unit there, because a MASH
Good
unit
point.
is a clear sign that things have gone south, and people are in dire straits. And
Mm.
so it's just, we what I like I said, what I spent generally, say for instance, if I spent $100 for certain items in a Kenya for or for a ministry, To do the exact same thing in Ethiopia, I would spend $1,500. And what I would do in
Unbelievable.
Somalia, I would spend $5,000.
Mm.
And that's just to get into cars and housing. And so my colleagues in the open countries, since they own their houses, they own their compounds, they own their vehicles, we all get the same budget. They have so much more money to do evangelistic projects. All of our money has to go into cars and houses and structural things, and we have almost no funds left to reach one of the most unreachable groups uh, in the world.
Mm.
So
Wow.
we've got to rethink that. We can't afford to be a bunch of mission socialists that everybody gets the same budget, even though we live in places where the cost of living is unbelievably different. Now, for our salaries, they do a cost of living. Our company does. So from country to country, they do a market basket survey, and so people that worked in some of the most expensive countries in the Horn of Africa, they would get a
Mm.
cost of living supplement that sometimes might be twice their salary.
Hmm.
But you go anywhere and buy a kilo, 2.2 pounds of meat and pay 25 to $50 for that. If it's
Wow.
worth eating, you can see, why if a Coca-Cola costs $3 to $5, you can begin to see again why the unreached are unreached. It's just so unbelievably expensive there. So you've got you want to send 20 workers out from your church, and you've
Hmm.
got a certain budget, and you don't belong to a mission board that has millions of dollars to call upon, but still the principle is the same. If they could support 100 workers in a country for the same amount of money they could support one family in an unreached country. Well, for a lot of groups, that's not a hard decision to make.
Mm.
So you're going to spend less money. The harvest is going to be so much greater, and yet what continues uh, to speak into our hearts and break our hearts is hearing the words of Jesus. And he said, "Go to all the peoples of the earth, go across the street, go to Jerusalem, go to Judea, go to Samaria, go to all the people groups of the earth." And of course,
Mm.
Jesus was fully aware of the cost that would mean in persecution and the
Right.
cost that would mean financially to go where you
Mm.
are further and further and further from your support system and from your ability to own property, to own vehicles, and to finance yourself for a reasonable amount of money.
Mm.
Uh, 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 we had some people that had medical problems in North Africa, so they moved to the UK, United Kingdom, because a good section of their people group lived in the UK. But they lived in such, the Saudis lived in such an expensive part of London that rent for an apartment has gone up to $6,000 a month.
Wow.
Who can do that?
Right. Right.
And so you end up living outside of that community and renting something for a sixth of the cost, but then that makes you a commuter. That that
Right.
that 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 limits the amount of time that your wife and your children and you can spend together in that
Mm.
community, incarnating Christ and using families to reach families. And so you're 90% of doing missions is learning the right language and living in the right place. That's 90% of your
Mm.
strategy. If you'll
Mm,
live in a place where you can walk out of your door in your apartment and meet people in the people group that you've gone to reach, or you live in a standalone house and you go out in the street and your children are playing with local children, and you can just walk and visit house to house to your people group, and you learn the language of your people. 90% of any good missiology is the language, the learning the right language and living where you can access your people group. But
mm,
oftentimes, the intensity of the climate and the expense of living in war zones and famine zones and
mm,
living in Kuwait and Qatar and UAE and Saudi Arabia and Bahrain and living in places like Somalia and Afghanistan where the prices get so inflated.
mm,
We mission, especially church sent workers, will look at their budget and say, "We just can't do this,"
mm. Well,
and
and Nick, let
therefore,
me ask you something
yeah.
because I know that we've addressed this before, but when we're talking about the cost and the expenses of this, something that you said multiple times just came to my mind is that it seems like the problem would be multiplied because it seems as if for every dollar that goes that churches are giving, only 1% are going to the unreached or somewhere thereabouts. So we're talking about not only are these places incredibly expensive to go to and to minister in, but we're not really giving much money to the unreached to reach the unreached to begin with.
Well, your money goes where your people go, and
Yeah.
if 93% of all missionaries that can call themselves that are in
Hmm.
Christian countries, then that means that 7% are in the and so what I'm describing to our listeners is
Hmm.
why the unreached are unreached. Only 7% of the workers are even trying to reach the 3 billion people.
That makes
seven
sense. Yeah.
percent of those who are sent out to the nations are sent out to the unreached, and they total right at 3 billion people. How is
Wow.
7% of the mission force going to begin to accomplish that?
We
Uh,
can't.
uh,
You're right.
uh, the butter is so spread so thin on the piece of toast,
Mm,
you can't even tell there's any flavor there whatsoever. We're just spread that
right.
thin.
Right.
And,
No,
and,
that makes a
and,
lot of sense.
and where we need teams, it's compounding the mistake because unreached people come to Christ, Anthony, when they meet somebody their age and their gender. And so the more expensive it gets, the less people we can afford to send. So the team might be
Mm,
made up of a couple 30-year olds, or maybe two or three single women a lot of times. Yeah,
mm,
and there are parts of Africa that is the graveyard for single women being sent out by themselves to some of the harder Muslim places on earth, and it's just an impossible
mm,
task. Asking single
mm,
women to interact with tribal leaders, with Muslim leaders, is just an impossible task. And
mm.
so you look at the 93% of missionaries are in the Christian world, the world that has already responded or has access to Jesus, and only
Right.
7% is going to the unreached world. I'm just repeating. One of the reasons we don't go is the climate, and it's just overwhelming expensive, and especially if
Mm,
you're church space sender and you can send somebody where you can have a one-time cost of car and house or
right.
compound, but you have to rent your stuff, and it's in the thousands of dollars. A lot of independent missions, they can't afford the budget.
Right. That makes so much sense. Makes so much sense.
And how do you build a strong evangelical presence when you're having to spend $5,000 per compound and $400 a month per vehicle? And,
Right.
and, and that
Right.
reflects the cost of food when you can get it, but oftentimes we have to carry it in. Now, here's what
Mm.
happened. United Nations, we're going into Somalia. I'm going into Somalia on cot plains. It's a plant that Somalis chew. They start around 5 o'clock in the evening, and they chew this plant, and it's spelled CHAT or KHAT or MIRAA, Marah, and they chew, especially the men, the women do too it, but they chew the leaves and sometimes
Mm.
the stem, that the coating of the stem of that plant, and it gives them a big high. And they'll go out and start shooting their weapons, and oftentimes Somali men would almost sell their children because of their addiction to this plant. But it
Mm.
causes all kinds of misbehavior, and they have that stuff flown in from Kenya, and it's
Wow.
very very expensive. And I'm in Hargeisa, my first visit into Somalia, and I see this
Mhm.
convoy of 15 trucks coming in, and I think hope is finally arriving, and that's filled with medicines, and it's filled with food and water, and it was filled with cot.
Mm.
And I watched men rush to
Wow.
those trucks by the hundreds with their wives' jewelry, with what gold they had stored from the wedding, and trade it for that drug to chew.
Mm.
There's
How
all kinds
miserable.
of reasons why the unreached are unreached, and that pushes me into the last one. It's just uh, uh, every hour that Ruth and I would spend in offering and receiving member care in the open countries that we have lived in places like Somalia, that 1 hour of member care turns in anywhere from 20 to 100 hours of taking care of our people,
Mm. I can
because
imagine.
it eats our people alive.
Yeah.
Here's another map you can lay over the world, and you can lay a map over uh, southern and eastern Africa. It doesn't mean they're easy places, but you can lay a map over that, and lay a map over a lot of South America, and
Mhm.
oftentimes I will see my colleagues from there staying there until they're in their 70s and sometimes their upper 70s in those places. When Ruth
Yeah.
and I left North Africa, Middle East, at 65 years of age, we were almost 10 years older than the oldest worker in North Africa and the Middle East.
Wow.
When you go to the places that are unreached and you factor in all of these things that we've been talking about, and now including climate, including expensive, including that there's very few workers there and it's hard to do member care, it just eats people alive. Living on the cutting edge eats mission personnel at a rapid pace. Oftentimes it means isolation, or it means
Mhm.
communal living, which is very hard for us Westerners. It's harsh climate. It's hard environments, and it's just tremendous hyphen spiritual warfare. Many
Mm.
agencies do a credible job in calling out the called and sending those to unreached peoples that have been obey who are trying to be obedient to the Great Commission, and they send them to the Somalis and the Afghanistans of this world, and then they forget about them.
Mm.
And they let us come home.
Oh man.
They let them come home because my our churches have been far different. And our mission board has been far different. But you come home after 4 years and you're bleeding on the carpet, and you're sending churches give you 30 minutes to do a commercial to talk about they don't want to hear about the number of people that were persecuted or killed or imprisoned. They want to hear the victory stories. They want to hear
Right.
the high number of baptisms. They want to hear all the people that entered the kingdom of God. And when you're having more people martyred than you're having people come to Jesus, it eats your people alive. You know what Beth
Right.
and I learned when we sent our people into Somalia? We sent in couples. First of all, I would go into a hard place like that and take a couple men like you with me. And we
Mm.
might do that for 6 months. And when it became stable enough, we would take couples in there who did not have children. Our children never lived in Somalia. And so we take in young couples that were yet to have their children, or older couples whose children were already grown and out of the house. And the United Nations would say to me, no, you're not going to take couples on our flights into Somalia. It's too dangerous for couples. And I said, listen, your job is to fund the flights. You don't
Mm.
get to decide who goes in there on these flights. And so I've made the decision that it's safe enough now for couples. And so we were the first ones to take couples in there. It never got safe enough to take children in there. And here's what I
Mm.
would do in a place like Somalia. I will take somebody like you, maybe another couple guys with me. We go in and out regularly for weeks at a time. As it becomes more safe and more settled, I take couples in without children. And as now, if you can go to your neighbors and you can go to local schools and your kids can play in the streets, then I'll take in families with children of various ages. And when things go bad, I do it the opposite. I will take out the families with children first. And they will say to me, Uncle Nick, this is not fair. Well, being strategic is never being fair.
Mm. Right.
You treating everybody the same usually is treating everybody badly. You know,
That's true.
every teacher has their pet, and what we found to back up to the other one, when we were having to put flights together with Lutheran airplanes in there. They would carry 6 and 7 ton of stuff into Somalia, or we would rent small planes with the United Nations that were going in and out with the Red Cross. But when the U.S. military and UN came in, we had these great big transport planes, and we had people in 3 places in Somalia and in the countries above Somalia, and the United Nations saved us around $60,000 a month in transporting our people in and out.
Wow.
And then overnight,
Unbelievable.
Black Hawk goes down, and
Mm.
in a matter of weeks, the U.S. vacates Somalia because of the loss of those 17 Rangers. I was a mile away when that happened, and I went over to the site where that helicopter was shot down and where the Rangers fought their way into that mess. I was over there the next morning at 8 o'clock in the morning, talking to
Mm.
Somalis and to Egyptians that were in a fort there, but never left that fort to go out there and help in that situation. I just telling it because I experienced it. But I could take our teams in and out all the time. But when the United Nations pulls out and pulls all of their flights out, where do I get $60,000 a month?
Right.
Where am I going to find people to fly those planes? Who's going to
Mm.
take in the medicine? Who's going to take in the water wells? Who's going to take in the resources that we need to keep things going there? And what we found Anthony, if we left our people in Mogadishu or in Somalia longer than 30 days, they began to become dysfunctional. And so
Mm-hmm.
Ruth and I, for 5 years of working in Somalia, of the 7, every 30 days, we brought those couples and those singles out. And they had a meal with us around the table that we would laugh, tell stories, we would cry, and oftentimes it got so personal and so deep around that table. I would reach and get that loaf of bread and I would break it, and my wife would go and bring the grape juice and set it on the table, and I would pour it in the cups, and I would hand it around to our family and to those families that had just come out of Mogadishu's, and we talk about how Jesus, the bread, was representative of the body of Jesus being broken, and how we were being
Mm.
broken for Jesus in Somalia, and how when Jesus poured the wine in that cup and gave it to the disciples, he said, "This is symbolic of my blood being poured out," and watching Somali believers be martyred and
Mm.
what that does to our people, watching that happen and being in that environment. We knew if we left them in there for more than 4 weeks at a time, what we could do after 4 weeks is bring them out, give them a home cooked meal. They could go to church on Sunday. They could go to the shopping centers. They could go to the restaurants. They could do everything you could do in an open Christian society. And what Ruth and I did for almost 5 to 6 years, Anthony, if you and your wife were to come out of Somalia after everybody had left and the children have gone to bed, we sit with you and your wife and we give you a free conversation. And that means that you and your wife can talk about anybody, any event, and anything, and it doesn't count. And our
Mm.
people would use bad language. These are workers. These are volunteers from our churches.
Mm.
They would say things like to Ruth and I, "Why did you put me on a team where no one's a Christian?"
Mm.
And they would say horrible things about their teammates. And they would say, just they're just on the edge of breaking, and 100% of the time, with 150 plus volunteers, the next morning after they talk to Ruth and I to 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, when they get up and they come to breakfast late, sheepish, the next morning, they look at Ruth and I as the boys went off to school, and they would say, "Oh, I wish we hadn't said that last night." And Ruth would say, "You didn't say anything. That was a free conversation. It's gone." We don't hold that in our heart. We don't hold that in our mind. But if they're still talking like that, if they come out on Friday and they're still talking like that, dysfunctionally, still emotionally fragile on Monday, we don't let them go back in. We hold
Mm.
them out. And unlike most mission groups, we meet together for 2 weeks a year. And 1 week a year, we meet to do strategy. And what we do, we just talk about what's working, what's not working. We go to a safe place, we go to a resort somewhere, and we work on our strategy. But before we do that week, 1 week a year, we come out, everybody comes out, we go to a resort somewhere, we bring a well thought of, well trained, highly experienced counselor from America who sits with every one of us and then leads us in prayer and Bible study for 7 days. And the first
Mm.
year, our people came out, excuse me, they said to Ruth and I, "You're making us see a counselor?" And they go in, and that counselor does testing, leads them through long conversation, then leads us in prayer and Bible studies and healing all through the week. The second year, our people come for that week of spiritual retreat and only spiritual retreat. No business is allowed. And their second year, they said, "Oh, what time do I see the counselor?" And the third year, when they
Amazing.
came out, they said to Ruth and I, "Get out of my way. I want to see the counselor first," because they
Wow.
had discovered how much they deserved to have someone love them and speak into their lives.
Right.
And for every hour that Ruth and I would spend in counseling team members in open places that were very difficult, we spent 10 hours plus. I mean, 10 hours plus in doing member care, pastoral care of our team members in the hard places like Somalia.
Mm.
It eats people alive. In the open places, our churches can come out and do crusades, hand out Bibles, witness door to door. Pastors can come and speak in the local churches. You can't do any of that in the closed countries.
Right.
You know what we're asking our churches to do? Our people in these unreached places, they have no place to play and they have no place to pray. Now, if you
Mm.
hear nothing else in all of these issues, hear this. They have no place to play and no place to pray. There is no church. There are very few workers. And it's hard to get on your face before God and worship Him, and for our people to take a vacation with their children from a lot of these places. They have to save up enough money to get on an airplane and fly to another country
Mm.
because there's no place to recreate in those war zones, in these
Right.
harsh environments among unreached peoples. And so we ask our churches, are your workers worth it? Are they worth you
Mm.
bringing out your praise team and going house to house, or bringing all of our workers in a house and just lead us in worship? And when that
Mm.
praise team starts singing our heart songs, not a single one of our workers will sing. They'll be weeping too hard because
Mm.
it's been 3 months, 4 months, or longer before they were able to get with a larger portion of the body of Christ and get on our face before God. Ruth and
Mm.
I go and work with teams that are from our churches and from other teams too. We do that for each other. We do this all the time, and we find stress in marriages, and we work with that, and we find stress with the children of the workers, and we deal with that, and stress among teams, and stress in the marriage, and we put out these fires, and you know what? We bring healing until we get to the airport, and it
Mm.
all falls apart again.
Mm.
Now we know what the question is. It's not how are your children? How is your marriage? Though we do ask that. What's going on in your team? The question we ask now is, when was the last time you were able to get on your face before God and worship? And they will
Mm.
sob. And people listening to my voice right now, you need to hear the word of God. You've got people on the edge all over the world that have not been able to worship God for such 6 months. And
Mm.
they are worthy of you taking a team from your church 3 or 4 times a year just to worship with that family, with that team, and take them through the throne of God. I'm sorry, you can't do a crusade. If you hand out Bibles,
Right.
you're going to get people killed. You can't go door to door doing evangelism. But I believe that those that you sent out to the unreached are worthy of you coming out and caring for them and counseling them and loving them and leading them in worship.
Mm. Wow.
And we've watched our people. If we left them in there for 5 weeks or 6 weeks, we would have to keep them out for 2 weeks for them to get emotionally, spiritually, mentally healthy enough to go back. But if we brought them
Mm.
out after 4 weeks, after a month, and gave them a full weekend out in an open place where they could worship, shop, go to church, go out to eat, and just be out in public without fear for their life, then they could gird up their loins, that Old Testament saying,
Mm.
and go back in
Right.
and do another 30 days. But guess what?
Mm.
We had the United Nations paying $60,000 a month so we could bring our people in and out. And we had to pull out when that was gone because I couldn't take care of our people. I couldn't take care of our people.
Wow.
I couldn't get them in, but if I got them in, I couldn't get them out. And so it's high personal maintenance. And so we go in now in these hard places where marriages are in stress, and children are having issues, and on, like I said. And the question we ask over and over again: when was the last time you were able to get on your face before God and find out it's been 3 months, 4 months, 5 months, 6 months? You
Mm.
cannot start something among unreached peoples, such as the house church in your home, if you're not modeling it yourself.
Mm.
If your own team is not coming together and modeling it yourself, you can't start something you're not doing. You can't
Right.
start something you're not modeling. And so when you take these 8 things, and Jesus has said, he has commanded us to go into all of the world. So we don't get to just go to the places that are good climate. We don't get to go to a place
Mm.
where there's ample hospitals and schools for our children, where the temperature is moderate, neither too extreme in heat or cold. We need to go to those places where we can get the most people coming to the kingdom of God for the fewest dollars spent. Well, if these things are true, then we are not going to be obedient to what Jesus commanded us to do. And Jesus said
Mm.
to his disciples, pick up your cross and follow me. And he said to them often, count the cost. And the cost
Mm.
of going to unreached peoples is 10 times to 100 times higher than it is to going to the open places. But Jesus has commanded us to go. And we should have been going for a few thousand years. And yet there are
Mm.
2.8 to 3 billion people in the places like I've been describing, the 8 reasons why the unreached are unreached. And it's so hard, and it's so far, and it eats people alive, and it's so expensive. We decided those people are not worth our witness and our sacrifice.
Mm.
Go to Nik Ripken website. Go to www.nikripken.com, and we will post, or have posted, why the unreached are unreached there. Print it off. Get it out and read it. Give it to your team members. Look at the ones that you have addressed, and look at the ones that have surprised you. And take all these things as a whole and go to your sending body. Go to your sending families. Go to your sending
Mm.
churches, and walk them through what your environment is like, and say, the only way we're going to make this different is to make Jesus known among the nations. And when they come to Christ, these things, the temperature might not go down or go up, but a lot of reasons why the unreached will dissipate when people give
Mm-hmm.
their lives to Jesus. And your reception and the fruit of your ministry changes, and the church is planted in house and home after home after home. But you've just got
Mm.
to be willing to pay the the price.
Mm.
And today, we've said to the unreached, you're too expensive. It cost us too much. You will have to go into eternity without ever hearing who Jesus is. May God forgive us when we become obedient to go to every place on earth.
Mm. Wow. How powerful. And like Nik mentioned, to our listeners, to you all out there right now, we do encourage you. We will have this on the website, www.nikripken.com. We'll put it on our social media if you don't follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, Nik Ripken Ministries. We encourage you to follow us because we'll put these here, and we want you to use this. Start that conversation. If you've got people overseas, how can you serve them? How can you minister to them while they're overseas? If you maybe you need to start the conversation in churches, how can we invest more to go to the unreached? Because Jesus is worth it, and they're worth it. Nik, give it to us.
Anthony, would you mind taking a personal moment and sharing with our audience how they can, if they are accessible to Ruth and I, how they can get us to come to their campus or for an extended time or especially to their body or to their mission group? How do they get in touch with us to
Yeah,
schedule
that's a
that?
great question. Yeah, absolutely. And our listeners may not know, but Nik, you and Ruth, you travel extensively. And sometimes I get tired when I try to follow your speaking and traveling schedule. But if you're familiar with the Nik Ripken Ministries, Nik and Ruth go all over, and not just like we say, a drive-by shooting, not just a Sunday morning sermon or something like that, but spending dedicated hours over a weekend with the church body or with multiple church bodies at one time, sharing these truths and practices, sharing these strategies, sharing and teaching these things and modeling these things so you as believers and you as churches can take these things and implement them in your own body and send and go and pray and give more effectively. And so the what you can do as churches or churches together is you can go to our website, nikripken.com, and you can go to the tab that says a speaking request. And in that speaking request, there's a kind of a long list of information. And what you can do is you can fill out the information. If you have an idea of a date and an event in mind that you'd like Nik and Ruth to come for a weekend and teach these principles, teach these workshops, you can fill out the information, and then we get the email that comes through the website, and then Nik and Ruth will pray over if they're available, if that weekend is free, if they're able to travel at that time. Then they'll pray through coming to your church or coming to your churches and sharing these things, coming to universities, coming to your sending agency or mission organization. So you can go to nikripken.com and go to the speaker request tab and fill that out. That will come directly to us. Believe it or not, Nik and Ruth read through every single request that comes, and they pray through if they're able to fulfill that or not. But we would love for you to contact us to see if Nik and Ruth can come and share what we've been sharing on this podcast in person on a deeper and broader level. It's hard to believe that we can go even deeper than what we do in the podcast, but you'd be amazed what God accomplishes through a weekend of just sitting together and learning at the feet of these believers in persecution, where all of these things that Nik and Ruth are teaching, where that has come from. So go to nikripken.com, go to the speaker request tab, fill out the information, then we'll get that and we'll pray through opportunities to be able to try to serve and go to your church or churches in the future. Nik, thanks for telling us about that, because we forget to remind people how to do that, and connecting you all to come to churches for a weekend. We stress a weekend because, like we'd say often, an hour on Sunday, you don't do it justice to what you've learned from believers in persecution. You just can't communicate those truths and those practices in a 45-minute sermon on Sunday. We really, really stress spending hours over a weekend together working through those truths and practices.
Well, it's been a joy to walk through this journey over the last number of weeks of why the unreached are unreached. And I just pray that our churches will deliberately count the cost and choose to go to the hard places and get the gospel to people that have never, ever had a chance to hear.
Mm. Nick, what's crazy, I was even thinking as you were talking today, and I get so engrossed in what you say that when you're like, do you have feedback? I think no, because I was paid too close attention to what you were saying. But even as you were talking, I hope some of our listeners come away with this, because as you were talking, immediately my mind popped in our church body, people that we know, friends that we have, we've got people in unreached places. We've got people in these really difficult environments, these harsh climates. I've been to those places in Central Africa where it's 115, 120 in the evening. Just miserable places. And so as you were talking, in my mind, I thought I've got a couple names that I need to contact. I need to say we're praying for you, we're checking in on you. I've got some other names to say, hey, you need to check out this podcast because there's some great ideas for you about how you can connect with our people to make sure they're taken care of, to make sure that we are doing right by them as they're in these unreached places. So for listeners, I hope you do the same thing. I hope that brings to mind how you can play a role in reaching the unreached and supporting people that maybe you have sent or maybe that you are sending into these really harsh and expensive and just very hard places around the world. So, Nick, thank you. I appreciate it. And you've given us a lot over these last few weeks and today, especially, not just to chew on, but to put into practice. I mean, we don't want to walk away saying that's great to think about. We want to put these things into practice because we need to be deadly serious about taking care of those who we're sending to the unreached, and we need to be serious about committing to give our people and our resources to the unreached. So those 2.8 to 3 billion people, they can have access to Jesus in the same way that we've had access to Jesus. So Nick, thank you. Uh, Tell Ruth that we are so appreciative of her as well. We're looking forward to having her again at some point on the podcast as well for an episode. And I'm going to go and not enjoy my triple digit degree weather. So I pray that you enjoy your much cooler your much cooler day today.
Yeah, we head for Alabama tomorrow for almost it'll be a 6 or 7 day trip, and so looking
Mm,
um, towards some real good, important speaking engagements and some folks along the way that we have worked with, and getting ready to go back to some hard places, and we're
mm.
just going to go see them.
I love that.
Yeah.
I love that. And we appreciate you not just teaching us, but also continuing to model what does it look like to support those people in those places. Well, Nick, thank you so much. We pray blessings and safe travels this week as you go to the lower country of Alabama. And to our listeners, we thank you for being with us. And like Nick mentioned, go to the website, go to our social media pages. We'll have these 8 reasons why the unreached are unreached. We'll have those accessible to you for you to take and give to people, and just really think through how can we make a difference in these places for those 3 billion people who have no access to Jesus.